Good morning to everybody. It's really a privilege for Casa Árabe to co-organize today with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung the conference Arab Spring Feuilleton Revisiting Societal Dynamics. This is an international seminar, and it's a privilege for us because it covers practically the gist of the activities we dedicate to the Arab world and the relations of Spain with the Arab world. Both economics, governance, and visual arts are intertwined today here in this seminar, and then in the show Syria Speaks, Syria Habla, to be held in this same place tonight. So welcome here to Casa Árabe. It's going, supposed to be a fruitful day, and I think as the morning goes on, more people will accompany you. I mean, I'm not sure if it's because it's Monday, but anyway, I'm sure there will be, this seminar will create momentum today and for the rest of the week and the months ahead. So let me pass the mic to Michael Schrecke, Director of the Office of Madrid of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, mostly those who came from abroad, have a long trip, and are actively participating here. And I'd like also to thank the Casa Árabe for this, to giving us this opportunity for this conference. As far as the content is concerned, I cannot contribute very much because I'm not an expert in the Arab world, but I have at least one impression that the Arab Spring, whatever now happened, some say that only Tunisia was a kind of success, that in other countries the situation is worse than before, but I think it's not reversible. That is the thing. It's not reversible for demographic and social reasons, because of new media as the social networks, but also Al Jazeera. So I think it's a reality, it changed reality and will be a reality in future. I hope we have a very fruitful discussion, and I'm sure that I will learn a lot here. Well, thank you very much for being here.
My name is Karim Hauser, and I head the governance program here at Casa Árabe. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here, and we're gonna go straight to our first speaker today with the opening statement. It's also one of the reasons why we thought of this conference and how we designed it, because of Maryam's book on civic entrepreneurship in the Arab Spring, or after the Arab Spring. So I'll introduce her briefly. Maryam Jamshidi is a lawyer and writer with nearly 10 years of experience working on issues relating to the Middle East and North Africa. Her writing has appeared in various academic publications as well as in media outlets such as Al Jazeera English and Truth Out. She's also the founder of Muftah.org, a digital magazine focusing on domestic and international issues affecting countries in the MENA region. Maryam received a bachelor's degree in political science from Brown University, a master's degree in political theory from the London School of Economics, and a JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. So before I give her the floor, we'll just tell you very quickly that we'll have this opening statement, and then we'll move on to our first session, that is the political session, after which we'll have a coffee break. And each speaker will have about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to a debate with the public. So, Maryam, welcome.
Thank you, Karim. Thank you to Casa Árabe and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for organizing this event. Thank you to all my fellow speakers and every single person in the audience who came out today to talk about these issues. Hopefully we'll have a productive conference. So, as I think we all know, there's a lot to be worried about in the Middle East these days. Libya and Syria are gripped by violence. ISIS, or IS, or whatever you want to call it, is wreaking havoc and death and reconstituting regional borders. Coups seem to have become the order of the day, and remnants of deposed regimes appear on the rise in places like Egypt and Yemen. Amid all of this violence, the heady early days of the Arab Spring almost feel like a dream, as if they never even happened. But I want to take a step back for a moment to think more deeply about where we were, where we are now, and the things that have changed in between. Because things have changed for the better at the grassroots level, and it started before the Arab Spring began. For much of the 20th century, many Arab countries were colonized by European nations in some way. Other regional countries were effectively Western puppets, operating at the beck and call of external masters. Many of these colonial and pseudo-colonial adventures ended in large part because of grassroots resistance from local populations that could no longer abide their chains. Of course, as we know, in many of these countries, post-colonial realities did not bring democracy or freedom. Instead, colonialism was replaced by indigenous forms of autocracy and dictatorship. But resistance continued in its own way, and civic and political movements of different types and varying strengths developed in the Arab world. While these efforts were sparked by various factors, they reflected a growing desire among local populations to resist and reject the passivity and complacency which their own governments expected of them. During the 1980s, so-called bread riots took place in countries across the region in response to the rise of neoliberal economic policies. These so-called reforms were the result, in part, of IMF-imposed structural adjustment programs that tied loans from the World Bank and IMF to the removal of subsidies on food and fuel. For decades, governments in the region had relied on these subsidies to shore up their authoritarian practices. By removing or substantially decreasing these provisions, governments betrayed the social contracts with their citizens, who responded by taking to the streets and expressing their dissatisfaction. In the decade leading up to the 2011 revolutions, political and social activism in the Arab world increased even further, primarily in the form of cause-oriented efforts that focused on specific issues or problems. In places like Egypt, the Second Palestinian Intifada gave a rise to activism for a new generation. In the early to mid-2000s, labor protests also took place with increasing frequency in various countries. From 2007 to 2008, bread riots returned to the Arab world, giving rise to what were then unprecedented street demonstrations that called for an end to high food prices, while also rejecting political repression and demanding government reforms. Activists in more closed or oppressive political systems like Syria mobilized around social issues that were less politically charged, but no less important to nurturing civic engagement. In other countries that had rich histories of organizing, like Bahrain and Yemen, activists pressed their demands directly to ruling regimes. During this important decade, some of these activities took shape as formal institutions or organizations. But informal groups that operated outside traditional political networks and brought together a broad coalition of actors were growing in number and influence. These groups were highly responsive to the facts on the ground and evolved and changed according to the needs and issues of their communities. Despite this growing tradition of activism, however, most people in the Arab world remained hesitant to express their views or mobilize to address issues or challenges facing their communities. Some were simply resigned to the status quo, hopeless about the prospects for change. Others were numb to daily injustices or were simply too busy struggling to make ends meet. But this all changed with the Arab Spring. In speaking out and taking to the streets, many people in the region made their public debut after years of being invisible to the state. It was a process that was both intensely personal and community-oriented, and at its very core about human dignity and self-determination. Grounded in a community of individuals acting and speaking together, this human togetherness empowered those involved to to risk investing both in one another and their communities. The public squares where the uprisings took place were laboratories of civic engagement. They promoted discussion and collaboration on issues of common concern among people who were oftentimes complete strangers. Before the revolutions, these public spaces where individuals could speak and act together, creating new realities in full view of their fellow citizens, were rare and largely non-existent. The region's earlier history of activism, combined with these public expressions of massive popular unity, created an explosion in informal and formal activism that continues even in the challenging atmosphere that dominates many regional countries today. I call this activism civic entrepreneurship. It represents any citizen-driven effort to mobilize communities to respond to opportunities or crises in order to further the common good. I think the most concrete way to explain what civic entrepreneurship is to tell a story about one example of this phenomenon from Egypt. So it's Cairo, late February 2011. After nearly 31 years of ruling the country, Hosni Mubarak has been ousted from power. The revolution is, however, far from over. Protesters are attempting to reoccupy Tahrir Square to protest against the interim government of Prime Minister Ahmed Shafiq, a member of Mubarak's old guard. The army isn't pleased. For the first time since the revolution began, the military quashes the sit-in in Tahrir Square, as well as in front of the parliament building. People are beaten, tortured, and taken away by the military. Military trials of civilian protesters began. In response to these events, an Egyptian film collective is born. Its name is Moserin, which roughly means we are determined. The group's first project, creating video campaigns about individuals, including friends who had been detained by the military, and disseminating these videos to the public via social media. These activities mark the beginning of the group's formal existence as a nonpartisan, independent film collective using video to raise awareness, educate, and enlighten Egyptians about political and social issues inside the country. Moserin's roots lay further back, however, in the 18-day uprising that had just taken place. Its founding members had been part of the original sit-in in Tahrir Square. Some had known each other before the uprisings, while others had met for the first time in that iconic public space. The tent where some of them slept had been known as Tahrir's media hub because of the raw footage they were creating of the demonstrations, as well as their efforts in archiving video created by others in Tahrir. For Moserin's future members, the square was a unique environment during those 18 days. It was a place teeming with people where meetings were effortless and the sharing and discussing of ideas constant. After Mubarak's ouster on February 11th, 2011, these conversations and meetings continued among those who would go on to found Moserin. Over the last 4 years, the group has adapted to changing circumstances. Its videos have transformed from rough cuts of raw footage to more professionally produced video narratives. It has metamorphosized from a small collective to a broad coalition of individuals inside and outside of Cairo, producing videos when needed at a fast pace. In November 2011, Moserin created a series of video campaigns about the violent government crackdown against protesters in Cairo's Mohammed Mahmoud Street. During these events, Moserin's YouTube page became the most watched nonprofit YouTube channel in the world. Its work documenting government abuses inspired the creation of another organization known as Kazabun. Kazabun is an independent nationwide movement of largely outdoor film screenings that has sought to expose the military's lies about violence it committed in the country. As Moserin grew, it began to hold workshops in various governorates around Egypt to teach people the basics of cinema activism, including filming and editing. Moserin has trained hundreds of people through this program. The group has also worked with activists in other countries, including Yemen and Syria, and has collaborated with various groups and movements in Egypt. Even in the country's current troubling circumstances, Moserin has somehow managed to keep working and putting out its videos. Examples of civic entrepreneurship like Moserin are even taking place in parts of the Arab world that are in the grips of extreme violence. Many of these efforts are focused on online activism, charitable and humanitarian work, and artistic and cultural efforts. Syria Speaks, which we will hear about later, is an excellent example of this. Another example is the group Raqqa is being slaughtered silently, which was created by activists inside ISIS's capital and is made up of a website and social media pages that document in both English and Arabic ISIS's crimes in the city. These organizations and movements are but a few examples of the countless initiatives of civic entrepreneurship that have developed across the Middle East and North Africa since the start of the Arab revolutions. But many analysts and observers who discuss the uprisings miss this aspect of these events. Instead, they focus on macro-level indicators like institutional reform or economic progress to determine whether the Arab revolutions have succeeded. Realizing meaningful systemic, political, and economic change doesn't just happen at the top of national politics, though. It's also a product of grassroots transformations, which include changing individual expectations and perspectives, shifting cultural attitudes, and even how people do business. This is the sort of revolution that has been taking place in the region, and civic entrepreneurship is how it has been happening. The phenomenon can be found across various sectors, including politics, art and culture, and even in the realm of technology. As we will hear about today, it includes video collectives like Mosarin, political and social movements, groups supporting civil society and the youth, anti-sexual harassment initiatives, internet activism, street graffiti collectives, organizations promoting music and dance, as well as civically minded tech startups. It involves political activists, artists, journalists, filmmakers, and entrepreneurs. So what is the value of civic entrepreneurship, and how does it help move societies in a better direction? Well, first, it keeps the revolution's goals alive. As new regimes come to power and old regimes resist overthrow, civic entrepreneurship creates a kind of shadow government, embodying the principles of freedom, dignity, and social justice, and reminding both the state and society of the revolution's values. It helps maintain the public sphere. The public sphere was key to the meteoric rise of civic entrepreneurship, and its continued vitality is critical for democracy to take root. By promoting public speech and action, as well as collaboration between individuals and groups, civic entrepreneurship keeps the public sphere alive and vibrant. In this way, it creates diverse nodes of power within society. The more power is concentrated in the government, the more unlikely it is states will move away from autocracy during fragile transitional periods. Through civic entrepreneurship, individuals and groups become counterbalances to state power. Where national governments continue to be weak or corrupt, civic entrepreneurship can help fill the gaps left by the state by providing much-needed services and tackling social problems. It teaches people through doing to negotiate, compromise, and engage with their communities. It creates an environment for new, younger leaders to emerge who have experience in organizing and coalition building and understand the importance of accountability. It allows for experimentation and quick iteration and adaptation on the local level, generating ideas that could benefit countries on a national scale. It reformulates divisive ideologies. Because divisions within society are a threat to civic entrepreneurship, which inherently depends upon unity and cohesion, the concept can help combat these divisive principles, like sectarianism and nationalism, and reformulate them in ways that facilitate rather than disrupt collaboration. But these days, achieving these benefits has become more difficult as civic entrepreneurs have come under attack nearly everywhere we look. In Egypt, for instance, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has instituted a pervasive crackdown against dissent, along with the ruling elite. His government has actively sown divisions within society that have predictably led to an increase in violence, which the government has then used to further oppress and suppress its enemies and critics. Egypt went from having the highest levels of street protests in the world in April and May 2013 to having these demonstrations effectively banned as of November of that year. Since the ouster of Mohamed Morsi and Sisi's rise, countless activists, artists, and media personalities have either reduced their activities or left the country altogether. What is perhaps most troubling about these circumstances is that they have taken place with the blessing of the majority of Egyptians, who are more than happy to see the military and security forces punish Egypt's so-called enemies from within. To combat these circumstances, prevent further erosions of the public sphere, and begin again making gains in Egypt and elsewhere, Civic entrepreneurs and their allies must commit themselves to several basic strategies. First, civic entrepreneurship must remain disobedient. Where it fails to do so, it can become a negative force. We saw this in Egypt, where Tamarrud, a popularly fueled movement from the grassroots, decided to join forces with powerful elites and pave the way for military rule of the country and Sisi's rise to power. For civic entrepreneurism to remain productive, then, it must maintain an adversarial relationship with those ruling the country. By contrast, obedience to the state gives the government an upper hand. It clears the way for populist politics, which often use social prejudices to sow division within the population, withering the roots of the public sphere. Where the government is supreme, one of the most important checks on state power is eviscerated, namely grassroots movements and organizations. Civic entrepreneurship must generally remain nimble and flexible, and therefore largely informal. Given the difficulties of being openly political in some countries these days, civic entrepreneurs must continue to adapt themselves to changing circumstances and engage with their communities in a range of ways. They should not be overly committed to a particular tactic or strategy and be prepared to innovate as needed in order to achieve their goals. In an atmosphere where freedom of expression and association are stifled, comparatively small victories should also be valued. More leadership is needed and even some formal structure for civic entrepreneurship to continue to thrive. Many have described the organization and movements that developed since 2011 as dominated by decentralized networks without any meaningful leadership. To a certain extent, this is true, but at the same time, a vanguard of activists, musicians, artists, and others did in fact emerge during this period. Many of these individuals took leadership roles in a number of organizations and tried to develop formal strategies for their activism. Going forward, more leaders are needed, in part to counteract the inevitable burnout many activists experience, especially during long periods of crisis. While much of civic entrepreneurship's value does come from its informality, some organizations will also need to develop more formal structures depending on the nature of their work. These more institutionalized groups can also provide assistance and support to other more informal entities. Outside allies need to wise up. Those who support civic entrepreneurship must recognize it comes in many different shapes and forms, that civic entrepreneurs, by and large, understand their communities better than even the most well-intentioned outsiders, and that tangible assistance to these groups must, in most cases, be based on recommendations made by civic entrepreneurs themselves. Civic entrepreneurship must oppose divisive ideologies. Civic entrepreneurs cannot afford to allow regional governments to continue deploying divide and rule strategies. Arab regimes are engaging in these efforts on an intense level, including Syria's Bashar al-Assad, who planted seeds of sectarianism at the start of the uprising, which have now taken root and grown. For his part, President Sisi has not only drawn a stark line between the Brotherhood and the rest of Egypt, but has also regularly emphasized class divisions between elites and the Egyptian masses. Civic entrepreneurs must take these narratives very seriously and oppose them by speaking and acting in accordance with pluralistic principles that unify rather than divide communities. They must build alliances with media and more formal civic and political groups. Civic entrepreneurs must recognize that most societies generally don't have a bottomless appetite for disruptive activism. Eventually, it seems, most populations will choose so-called stability and order over a vibrant public sphere that disrupts daily life. As recent events in Egypt have shown, popular political support is more important now than ever. Where possible, then, civic entrepreneurs should look to build relationships with established organizations and political groups that share their general values. They should use these alliances to advocate for their work more broadly within society and to also protect themselves from political elites who will inevitably want to control and or eliminate them. Even more critically, civic entrepreneurs must develop strategies for directly communicating with average people in ways that resonate. This can come in the form of their own independent media outlets or through alliances with third-party media companies. Finally, even during times of armed conflict, civic entrepreneurs must remain non-violent. While this limits the kind of work they can do during these times, their contributions are no less valuable. In fact, because civil wars are so divisive, civic entrepreneurs are even more critical force. They keep the values of unity, civic engagement, and pluralism alive in besieged communities and lay the foundation for a post-conflict period that is hopefully in line with these principles. As the last 4 years have shown, like a stubborn vine, civic entrepreneurship will find a way to burst through and flower. Even in these times of adversity, it remains a bright spot and a critical means of ensuring that regional states transition in the long run to pluralistic societies with accountable and transparent governments that serve the needs of their citizens first and foremost. Thank you.